Hey there, I'm Loki. That's Tristan, and welcome to today's episode of Pitching the Content.
Pitching the content where two idiot English majors try to convince the other to watch something. Somebody is the pitcher. They try to get their content up with an elevator speech and see if it survives big brain time. Today's pitcher is
Yours truly,
Loki.
Lokester, and today I will be pitching to you Arknights. Sort of. What I'm actually pitching is the characterization in gachas, specifically focusing on Arknights, but also referencing a little bit of FGO and Fire Emblem Heroes.
Okay. I have a mediocre understanding of characterization in gachas. I don't play your Arcanites. I have seen you play a little bit of it, so I understand how the gameplay works. I play Fae, but I have not read a single thing from Fae. I play with the volume off. I understand nothing about gachas as a storytelling device. I will be honest.
So, the main thing about gachas is they always focus on trying to sell you their characters. Because after all, they are games. They don't want you to buy their currency so you can do their summons and buy their characters.
Yeah.
But the way they usually all pitch their characters is different. For example, Fire Emblem Heroes, their main way to sell you their characters is through A, nostalgia for characters from the original games that you played, or B, through having good skills that will either be good for you to pass on to units you like better, or just make the unit really good to use in their competitive modes like Arena or Aether Raids. But it's a bit different for FGO and Arknights because they don't have those competitive modes. So the way they sell you their characters is a lot more like based in the characters rather than what the characters provide. So for FGO specifically, it'll be a lot of like the character animations. You'll want to see really cool ones. They'll want to be a cool uh character, a cool like interpretation of that character since it's always a historical or mythical figure. Uh They'll have really cool animations, really cool buffs to help you clear the challenge quests or everything. And then Arknights, which doesn't really have that super in-depth combat style that FGO has. It will morely focus on character design to sell you their characters, and then uh, Arknights is a bit weirder because a lot of their characters from 3 to 5 star usually fill the same niche, just depending on what category they're in. And then the 6 stars just sort of like do their own thing that's kind of similar. So let's see. To
From
start with,
so we're drawing a distinction between all three of these games, right? So Heroes doesn't really have to make good characters because their selling point is in one gameplay, two nostalgia. So the character design of Arknights matters way more than in FGO and in Heroes. If I'm getting this right, right? Arknights, like the characterization and like the writing has to be but just straight up better than the other two because those are the main selling
yeah,
points of it.
because unlike in Heroes, where they're expecting the main connection for you to be with the characters from the original game. They're expecting you to have some connection to them, or they're going to be throwing in a lot of references to stories from the games and the characters, and they don't really let the characters do too much. A lot of the story in Heroes was regarded as really poor up until like maybe halfway through the second chapter, and even then it's still regarded not very highly. But I would say that from my experience with the game, the times when the characters shine best is in this new event, Forging Bonds, where they actually let the characters interact with characters from other games. Well, it's not exactly canon. It is interesting to see your favorite characters interacting in these new and distinctive ways, which is what a lot of people want from characters in the gacha that they're not playing for gameplay.
Yeah, like in that Forging Bonds, we talked about this before with Owain and Shannon, like Owain just talks about how he's the fell being and I'm the knight of darkness and all this shit, and Shannon takes him seriously because that's like Shannon's personality. So like to watch that dialogue back and forth where Owain's like, "Yes, I am the fucking prince of darkness and I will clap your cheeks," and Shannon's like, "Ah, shit, I'm gonna fucking." Oh, yeah, it's very entertaining to watch. Like they are like kind of one note between them, but like it's fun. It's fun to watch.
Yep. That's why I really like the Forging Bonds event. It's probably what I consider to be the only really good event. Tempest Trials is okay, and all that other stuff is whatever.
Yeah, gotta
Uh,
agree there. But it sounds like
mm,
FGO, since there's not really a multiplayer section, is FGO better with storytelling?
yeah, because FGO is essentially a light novel, but with gotcha elements. Uh,
Oh,
FGO also had FGO also had that problem where a lot of the early storytelling felt a lot weaker than the storytelling that they developed later on. Because especially in a game like this, and Arknights had the same problem, they're trying to introduce the players to a universe, so much of that early stuff is just boring exposition where they keep trying to tell you, hey, here's this complicated term that exists in our magic universe, but it'll only come up like 5 times, but you should kind of remember it because we think it's really impressive. And so a lot of that happens, especially early on.
so I get the
And
feeling
then
that you're way more impressed with Arknights than the other two.
uh I wouldn't put it that way. Arknights is more or less my current obsession, especially since the last event that they had was a really good story event. I really liked it. But FGO also has some really exciting stories, like the Babylon story that they just got animated, and then the Camelot story that they're getting turned into a movie. Those were
Oh,
both very good stories that I like.
and you
But
talked a lot of
the
praise about
things
the
that made
Salem
those
one.
Salem was also a really good one. I thought it was an interesting take on how to throw the characters into the Salem witch trials, which is a very controversial event in history. Um, but those the main reasons that those ones shined a lot more than the earlier ones is because they let the characters do more in the story than just have you go through the area and then tell you what's going on and throw these complicated, not real terms at you. So the main reason that the Arknights event that I spoke of, called Code of Brawl, was so good was because it followed uh, one of the groups that's more, I guess you could say, energetic in the universe that they've introduced. It's called Penguin Logistics, and Penguin Logistics is run by a penguin named the Emperor who wears a two-pack shirt and is hilarious. So any event run by his company, that's got to be hilarious. And it delivered both an entertaining story and one that had like interesting stakes, and all just was very smooth in how it progressed. The gameplay sort of matched up with the story as much as you can make tower defense waifus match up with a VN. But I really find it the story was very fun to experience. Watching as the new character they were introducing, Bison, had to follow along with all these characters' crazy antics, getting thrown off a bridge, dealing with fake Italy's mafia.
What?
Yeah, it was a lot, but it was good.
Oh, okay. So it sounds like in Arknights they allow a story to actually happen, unfold, and characters actually get to participate. Whereas, what I have seen in Faye is like, well, bro, you're cool. Oh shit, bro, I really am. And like the only story and narrative that you can follow is like Sharina and Alphonse and Niffle and all of that, which no one actually gives a shit about. So yeah, it
Yeah,
sounds like Arknight's more interesting in that way.
yeah. Arknights is the most unique among the 3 because it follows its own universe and doesn't have to deal with, or rather isn't trying to focus on characters from a different game or FGO where you're always going into, like, a historical scenario or something. Uh, FGO's
Oh, the power of creativity. Like they just literally have no rules on them. So they can have more fun with it, basically. Yeah, it's
Yep, that's one of the main things that I really like. Uh, just listening to a lot of the characters' lines is interesting. I've personally been obsessing over trying to get a certain character just to get lore on another character because it's so spread out, which is
oh, that's
one of
fucking
the
that's good.
it's one of the faults in it, not just as being a Gacha game, but also being a game set in its own universe where they're already introducing you to a bunch of characters who have history and they have some of that history set and they're hinting at it, but it's so frustrating because they're not showing it because it's not what's currently going on. And you want to know what happened, you want to know what's going on over there, but the story's over here, and you're just like, oh, this is good, but I really want to know what happened over there.
That makes a good point. Yeah, I mean, if story is being gated behind characters, and like, if even if you, oh man, because a gotcha cast is so big. I've seen you scroll through your
Yeah,
roster of characters. So if your character is not up to plate in the current story, that means you're gonna have to wait like 5 to get yours in the next one. Like, damn, dude.
yep, that's always how it is. FCO has a really nice way of going about it because in the first part of FGO, which was their tutorial all the way up to uh, the Babylon story, and then the 4 little side stories that they had in between part 1 and 2, those were always like they inserted you into a point in time where history is being messed up to create the incineration of humanity. So you have to go and deal with what's messing up history to prevent the incineration.
Okay,
So,
that
like,
makes
for
sense. So you're doing
example
Back to the Future shit.
mhm, for example, in chapter 5, you were sent back to the United States during the time of the Revolutionary War, but the way that it had been fucked up was, for some reason, heroes from Celtic mythology were turning it were, like, invading, and so the Celts the Celts had the western part of America, or the eastern part, and the Americans had the eastern part, and they were fighting a civil war to not get eradicated by the
What
Celts.
the fuck? George Washington crossing the Missouri River to kill fucking Tulane? Like fucking what the
That's
fuck?
more or less what happened.
What, bro? It's King Arthur and General Gawain. We gotta fucking shoot them with our muskets and shit. That's interesting. I like that. I mean, how else are you gonna make those historical factions fight each other? I think seeing, you know, General Washington square up with Scottish mythology is more interesting than Tale of Genji. I am Genji. This is Lady Murasaki, and you are only going to see ancient Japanese people in this one. So yeah, it's kind of cheesy, but it sounds like it's at least fun.
Yeah, they do have some stories like that. I think I can only think of the one where they actually did have it was I didn't play that one, so I can't speak to it yet, but that one was one that spoke of, it only had, like, the Japanese heroes in it. That one was,
Oh yeah,
Shimosa?
but they have a lot
That
of
one had a lot of
Japanese heroes, right? So it's not like they were at a
yeah,
lacking of them. Yeah.
mhm, but I think even then, the characters that you encountered weren't always the characters that they appeared as, if I
Oh.
remember correctly. So, like, some of the characters you saw were actually different people, but because that story, I believe, was like a dream sequence, you saw them as characters you recognized, and not as who they actually were.
Okay, because so it has like a cognitive, like a Persona 5 of like the way that you understand things are shaping what they look like. So, okay, that's cool.
Mhm.
But speaking of characters, do you hear that sound?
What sound is it?
It's big brain time.
It's big brain time.
Big brain time.
So today's big brain time is dynamic versus static and iconic characters. Dynamic characters, as the term exactly sounds, are characters that change over the course of the story and have an arc. Static characters do not change, and iconic characters do not change, and we like them for it. So, an example of a dynamic character would be anyone that goes on the hero's journey. If we can track, say, The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. The Invisible Man starts as a college student. He only cares about what's in his sphere. And in the scene where he's driving the dean of his school, he doesn't care at all about outside of himself. He's really working for self improvement and self growth. And as we continue on through The Invisible Man, you see him start seeing the hardships that other black people are facing, and then it convinces him to join the Brotherhood. We all know what that means, and become a spokesperson for the people that he believes in. So his character arc went from caring about a small sphere to carrying out a bigger sphere. And in Brandon Sanderson, who is explicitly a fantasy writer, his terminology for this was there are sliders for characters. Such an interesting way to put it. There are sliders for characters, and they change throughout the course of the story. Some of them are static, and some of them are not. So, uh, we would put competency on one slider, we would put likability on another slider, and we would put social skills on another slider. So where the Invisible Man would place is at the beginning of the story, he's at zero competency for convincing others to change because he gives a speech and it just doesn't work. You can see that in his short story Battle Royal. And at the end of the book, the slider has changed. So he is a much better speaker and he cares a lot more for people outside of his own personal sphere. So he's a dynamic character because his slider went from here to here. I'm going to put that in editing. No, I'm not. That's going to be awful. An example of a static character would be someone who doesn't usually matter to the plot. Or this is why this is a crutch that bad. I hesitate to say bad, but there are static characters in everything because they don't matter to the plot and we're not going to see them either more than once, or maybe their staticness gets them killed. So if they refuse to see their flaw, they might die. Yeah, classic Grecian tragedies. If you refuse to see your hubris, then you're gonna die. So an example of a static character probably be on The Great Gatsby, probably Jordan Baker. She, at the beginning of the book, she expresses that, if I'm driving a car, I don't really give a fuck about anybody else on the highway. And then the protagonist says, "Oh yeah, but what if you meet someone else on the road who's just like you? Aren't you gonna get into an accident?" And she's like, "Yes." And at the end of the book, she carries that same exact attitude. So Jordan Baker would be described as a static character. There's a lot there. Fitzgerald, not particularly fond of women, especially his wife. So there's that to unpack, but without bringing Fitzgerald's personal life and his political views into it, Jordan Baker in The Great Gatsby is a static character. And the last thing I want to bring up is an iconic character, which is a static character. They don't change throughout the course of the story. All their sliders stay the exact same, but we kind of like them for it. We mostly see this in old James Bond and old Sherlock Holmes books. Brandon Sanderson kind of coined this term. I haven't seen it in any other spheres. An iconic character. in that Sherlock Holmes, throughout all of his books, he never changes. He's always the same exact guy, except for the more recent stuff. But I haven't looked at any of the recent stuff, so not in here, huh? And you really just want to watch Sherlock Holmes solve a mystery because that's awesome. So he never
It
changes.
is.
His competency always at max. His likability always at -3. But we want to watch Sherlock Holmes go through the effort of solving a mystery because it's just awesome to go through. So there you have it: dynamic characters, static and iconic characters. And I can see how this would be relevant to gotchas. I think in my meager experience in gotchas, I think that for the most part, characters in these games are going to be static or iconic characters because that's how you sell them. I mean, I wouldn't want to
Yeah.
roll for Owain. I love Owain, but I wouldn't want to roll for him if they, for some reason, changed his character in Heroes.
Yeah. So the thing about gotchas is once a character is out, they're pretty much out. And there's
Oh, so they
usually
can't grow at all.
well, it's not that they can't grow, but rather it limits where they can go with that unless they introduce like an alt, which is a whole different thing.
Yeah,
But
yeah. Can you rank the Camilla's static her storyline from Camilla to Camilla?
yeah. Uh so the thing about characters in gotchas is once they come out, they can't really be edited too much because technically you've paid most of the time you've potentially paid to get that character.
Yeah,
And so if they were to do something like kill that character off in the story and then take away all your copies of that character, they're taking away something you potentially paid for. So they can't really like
yeah.
mess around too much with something like that. But usually what they go along with is they in Heroes, for example, they introduce a character and they'll reference what that character was like in the original game. They'll throw in a couple of lines where they're experiencing this new world and how they feel about it compared to what they were personally like in their own game. So they usually don't give you too much on that
Yeah.
just because the characters unfortunately don't usually have much personality, especially the older ones, since because by the nature of the original Fire Emblem games, any character could die, so most of them don't have a story role outside of the chapter they're recruited.
Oh yeah, like Rice. What personality could you assign Rice? For anyone who doesn't know, Rice is he comes in the first Fire Emblem game. His only line of text, I'm pretty sure, is just "I am but a humble healer. Take me with you." And I'm pretty sure those like 8 words are his only lines. So what do you do with that if they put him in the game? They either have to make it up or and making it up would be not faithful to the original, right? That wouldn't fly with Rice fans who love his 8 words. Or you could use what you got, fucking play with those 8 words, just move them around every time, make new lines. I don't know. There's nothing
Mhm.
there.
So that's how Faye gets most of its characters out, but it's a bit different for FGO and Arknights because F in FGO there's a few characters that have basis in their other series, like obviously the biggest ones, Stay Night, Zero, Apocrypha, Extra, all that nonsense. And sometimes they'll throw references into that, but most of the time the characters by nature don't have memories of those other stories just because of the way that they've described that system works. Every time a hero is summoned, they don't have memories of other summonings. They mainly just have knowledge of the world at the time and whatever they would need to know in correspondence to their abilities. So, one example of that is King Arthur. King Arthur knew how to ride a horse, right?
Yeah, okay.
So therefore, King Arthur has the riding skill, which means if King Arthur is summoned in modern times, King Arthur could competently drive a car or a motorcycle.
Okay. Okay, I like that. And then at least that means that they're in context. Their abilities are translating. Like it might not be 1-to-1, but that's better than King Arthur coming out as like a fucking, I don't know, like a foot fighter when he was a horseback guy the whole time.
Hmm. Uh, so in FGO, a lot of the way that characters, the characters don't usually develop too much as far as the ones that you like have in your barracks. The characters are usually maybe they'll gain like two or three voice lines in reference to a character that they know being added later on, but most of the time they stick with the same voice lines that they get at the beginning.
Okay.
And instead of growing in your barracks, they might give that character a chance to shine in a story. For example, King Arthur. The original version of King Arthur hasn't really starred in any stories, at least as a major role, but they did have a hypothetical version of King Arthur where instead of wielding her sword Excalibur, she wielded the lance that she was said to wield, or she uh, was said to wield for the last 10 years of life, Rongo Miniad. And Rongo Miniad is a divine spear. It's not like a holy, so it's not, it's more potent than the kind of holy sword that Excalibur is. It's divine and it's technically got the power to help its wielder ascend to godhood. I don't,
Okay. That makes
yeah.
sense because okay, so then that's kind of changing who Arthur would be as a person because Arthur is like a king
Mhm.
for most times. He's like a humble guy. He wants to help his country and he's never self-centered. Like his whole thing is that he's selfless and he gives it up. But if he chooses to wield the spear instead of the or instead of the sword, then he could kind of be like, you know, Big Dick Bob.
Mhm.
Like,
And just a little bit of spoilers for that specific story here. I'd skip ahead maybe 2 minutes if you don't want to hear any spoilers. I know, probably more. Overall, they'll be spread out. Spoiler warning for all those who care about gotcha stories. Uh, in the chapter where this hypothetical version of King Arthur appeared, they were actually the villain of the story
oh, what the
because they had,
That's I knew
because
it.
they had because they had lost like sight of their humanity and caring about every one of like every person. Uh, they the way that their mind translated being a god was to escape the incineration of humanity. They picked and chose who could survive and were going to survive inside the legendary spear Rongominiad, which I believe is said to like be part of what holds the Earth in its axis. I'm not that great with all the super
Oh,
weapon
well,
lore.
not that that matters. Basically, they just get to pick and choose who dies instead of trying to chase everyone, trying to save
Hmm.
everyone. So that's a very different arc. Yeah.
And then the characterization in Arc Knights, it also has that same issue where once you roll a character, they don't really gain any lines. Uh, as you use the characters in the game, they gain trust with them, which helps you unlock further dialogue in the
Oh.
general when you appoint them as your assistant. But that's still pretty static. It doesn't really give you much chance. So in Arc Knights, when you want to see a character develop, you have to wait for them to get featured in an event. That's when they really get to shine. That's why people really liked Code of Brawl because it gave all those fun characters from the Penguin Logistics who have a lot of fun voice lines regularly and just seem like a good, fun group. They really all got a chance to shine in that event, and it was really enjoyable for the players.
Okay. So these three gotchas are like a perfect example of static characters for the most part, just because of the nature of their
Mhm.
games, and that every single story has dynamic characters. That's kind of like the point of storytelling, right? Showing a person's
Yeah.
growth and then telling the audience you should grow too. That's kind of the point of a lot of like literature and a lot of storytelling. But gotchas, do not have a bigger humanitarian reason in mind, and they aren't trying to convince you to do something. They just want. I mean, they're convincing you to do something, and just give them money. So their
Yeah,
point, yeah. So they need to make static characters because that's how you're gonna make money. Like, what if what if the people that got the first Arthur, who liked Arthur for being a good guy, and then instead of making an alternative Arthur, they just they just said, your good guy is now bad guy. And then no one would like that because, like, now my favorite unit is a lance guy. He's not a rider. He's a whatever he is in that game or in that story. And yeah, so, like, because of their medium, they can't use dynamic characters in their storytelling,
mhm.
which
The
makes
one
their
time that
storytelling,
all
like,
these
weird. Okay.
the one time that all these gotchas try to implement dynamic characters is with the one that's usually the most controversially received, the original characters or the assistant characters. In Arknights, every character is an original character, so it's hard to say
Yeah.
that. But in Fire Emblem Heroes, it's Alphonse, Sharina, technically Anna, but Anna's not really different from all the other Annas in the games,
Yeah.
so you can't really say much to her. Uh, I know a lot of people really, really disliked Alphonse at the beginning. He was most of the people's least favorite because they thought his design was boring and he was the least cute of the three. But I know at least during the second chapter, a lot of people started to feel better about him. They felt like he was actually getting some good growth and characterization. He's still pretty boring, but he's definitely the most interesting of the three now.
Yeah, because of
And
spoiler alert Liv, right? That's just way more interesting.
that is true. I always forget that he's technically also Alphonse.
I
Well,
don't
Jello.
I like Liv more than I like Thracier, and there's no
Fair?
and because Sharina's dead. So yeah. That's- sorry, my bad. But yeah, Thracier and Leaf, like, offering that alternative thing, just like the Arthur thing, makes the juxtaposition and the highlights of what makes those people so different. It makes them more interesting. So yeah, I mean the explicit fact that Alphonse doesn't get killed in this alternate timeline makes it more interesting because we get to see how he shapes the world. So that's a good point. You know what? I am hopping off the Alphonse hate train. I'm walking now. I'm still gonna hate him, but at least I'm gonna walk.
At least you'll walk side by side instead of just leaving him in the dust.
Open
Still
the
not gonna
future.
raise him though.
Open the future. Open. Oh, I. When someone's got that 5-star Alphonse, don't send.
Although you did just remind me that the one case of dynamic characterizations in any of these gotchas where it did affect the character's playability is Mash, the assistant character from FGO. They we recently got our part 2 story where we finished the arc from the original story. We prevented the incineration of humanity. And then we did our 4 side stories that were in between part 1 and part 2. And then they introduced a new storyline for part 2 where there was a new problem for us to solve. And in it, and during the first chapter where we go to Russia, uh, just for a little bit of context, in part 1 of EFCO, the story was always you went to a point in history where something it was usually a notable point, like uh, the French Revolution, where in the 1600s, I believe, where they
Yeah.
had Jeanne d'Arc, the killing of Jeanne d'Arc, uh, or this Revolutionary War in the America chapter. So there was always you were going to a point in history where something was supposed to happen and something else was happening instead. and so you had to prevent this thing from happening to fix history.
Okay.
But in part 2 FGO, the story is now you're the world is eradicated in several parts of the world. There's now uh how best to put this? There's essentially an area where sort of the similar thing to the original part where you go into a point of history where something fucked up, but instead of going to the point where it was fucked up, you're
Get to go
going
before it.
no, you're going possibly centuries after.
Oh,
So so the world is now different than how it's supposed to be. History's been different and it's been different for several hundred years. For example, the first story you go to Russia and in this Russia 500 years ago there was a third ice age that hit the earth and
oh.
humanity to survive had to combine themselves with demonic beasts. So now humans all look like furries.
Then how do you? No, why are you going to 500 years after this cataclysmic thing happened? How do you solve the cataclysmic thing if you're after it?
Those are more like story spoilers that I don't really want to go into
Okay,
in
I
case
will.
anyone or any of our viewers want to go into it. But it's a different system than what was originally going on in the first part is
Okay,
what I'll say.
but that this character, that your assistant, they.
Yeah. So in the first part, uh the way that this character Mash got her strength is she was fused with a heroic spirit, Galahad from the round table.
Yeah.
But at the end of part 1, another spoiler alert, seriously. Uh Galahad more or less finished with her. He more or less thought that she could go on her own, and so he doesn't really lend his power to her anymore. So she can't draw upon the same power that she did during part 1. So in part 2, they actually provided a costume sort of that gave her different skills. So her gameplay was completely different.
Oh, but that was an optional thing.
It's optional in everything except for the story.
Okay. Okay, and the story isn't everything. So you still people did you have to roll for Mash or did you automatically get her?
Mash you automatically get, and they automatically gave you strengthenings for her. So
Okay, so
it
then
yeah,
most of the problems that we had with this earlier isn't much of a problem because it's not like people had
yeah.
poured money into her because she was a free unit. Um, and what made her interesting, was Galahad, Lancelot's son, being with her. What part of the Fisher King myth, and it's actually more interesting, I think, that he leaves. So, not that
Mhm.
I understand it anything at all, but I think it's kind of cool that you get to use old her as a unit still. And not in the story, which is might be some people's main focus, but if you're playing, the time trial, I don't know what other game modes there are in FGO, but it's not like their money is wasted.
Nope. But it was a very interesting thing. Uh, I wouldn't say that people hate it, at least story-wise, because I think it's a very good and interesting, like, way to grow her character.
Yeah.
Uh, gameplay-wise, the new one's definitely inferior to the
Really? They fucking
one.
nerfed a character. That's so weird.
I wouldn't I wouldn't say they nerfed it, rather they shifted her focus. So,
And she's
before she
Dugan.
was, kinda. 'Cause originally she was a defensive tank that was good at, like, drawing attention to herself, but also defensively buffing the entire team, but now she doesn't really have that defensive buff for the whole team, and she has an actual offensive buff solely for herself. So she's more self-focused, which sort of makes sense from a story a story perspective, and I've actually heard, because I more or less keep up with the Japanese version of the game as well, which is 2 years ahead, and
Wow, that's a long time.
apparently yeah, it took them a while to get the localization, and they're still updating a lot of it. Um, but yeah, I've heard that she actually gets, uh, a cooler buff that actually makes her way stronger. But we have quite a
Okay.
ways before we get that.
So out of all three gotchas that we have talked about today, there is exactly like 4 dynamic characters. Team Alphonse and Mash.
I
Everyone
wouldn't really
else,
count Alphonse unless you want to include Fjorm as a more dynamic character.
Fajorm. Yeah, I guess if you
Fjorm.
do clue into the storytelling, they do kind of Fire Emblem writing. I don't know about that, but at least
Yeah.
mostly in gotchas, if we had 2 categories, 99.9% of characters go into static, and then we got Alphonse, Fajorm, all the niffles.
Yeah. Alphonse, Fjorm, Mash, and then Arknights is Amiya.
What's
Although even
what's a
then, she has
Mia?
real. Amiya is essentially the Mash of that game. She's your assistant character. They gave it to her for free. They gave her
I
to
thought
you
every
for free.
character can be an assistant.
Um, More accurately put, in Arknights, you work for a pharmaceuticals company called Rhodes Island,
That's
and
awesome.
she owns that.
Oh, okay. Well, it's 41 minutes in, so this was a fruitful conversation. Thank you guys for tuning in to pitching the content. I hope you enjoyed this episode. It may not have been as story focused as the last 2, but I think that we have hit a lot of nails on a lot of heads. Missed a couple of nails. Got some nails in
Missed
without
a couple of
hammers.
heads.
I think it was
And
good,
remember,
right?
if you have a gambling addiction, call 1-800-GAMBLING.
And if you have a car and you need to donate it to a kid, call 1-877-CARS for kids. Thanks for tuning in.
1-877-KIDS for
Cars.
cars.
2877 suck me up. Dun 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 dun. Oh yeah, I tell you something. I think you'll understand when I say that something.
I'm gonna fuck yes.